Parental Alienation Day. This is a very charged term and topic, and I've been working with numerous parents from California and actually across the country for over a year and a half now, talking about family court, the issues of custody in family court, and how parental alienation plays into family court. So joining me tonight is Joe Sweeney. He's the director of the Center for Modern Courts, and Kathleen Russell, the director for the Center for Judicial Excellence, to discuss this topic of parental alienation and why is it that we have a day to celebrate, not celebrate, but rather commemorate parental alienation, which is tomorrow, April 25th. So I'll start with you, Joe. If you can tell me what is parental alienation? The way I understand it is one parent basically pollutes or corrupts the mind of the child against the other parent. This is what I get from some parents who say that they're suffering from it. How can you describe what parental alienation is?
Yeah, I mean, that's generally correct. So the idea is that one of the parents, in order to kind of get back at the other parent, typically during or after divorce proceedings, will try to pit the child against the other parent, and then might use that during the court proceedings to try to say that that parent maybe shouldn't have custody, and so there needs to be a custody change, or to prevent that child from being with the parent in the first place. So there's a lot of theories behind whether or not this is actually happening and what the pathology is behind it. And it's kind of an evolving topic, so that's, I think, why it's kind of a hot button issue.
I think one of the main reasons that people declare a day is to raise awareness. And part of our conversations, Kathleen, in the past about parental alienation and the raising of awareness of parental alienation is what that can result in a worst-case scenario, when we are all thinking that people go to court to get back at their exes. And how parental alienation could be used in that context. Can you tell me what kinds of reservations you have with the term of parental alienation, and where does the term of parental alienation come from?
Yeah, parental alienation is junk science as far as I'm concerned, and a lot of credible legal and medical organizations, including the American Bar Association, the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, the National Prosecutors Institute, all say that parental alienation has no place in a court of law. And yet a lot of because the family courts are so unregulated, it gets used as a weapon by oftentimes abusive parents who are trying to deflect attention away from their abuse. So it's a really easy way, and I say it's junk science because it's not been verified as a legitimate science. It's not in the diagnostic and statistic manual, despite the efforts of numerous advocates who believe in parental alienation to get it in there. Mm-hmm. It's simply not supposed to be allowed in a court of law, and more often than not, when it does get alleged, it's being alleged by fathers against mothers, and there's some research coming out now which shows that even when it's not proven that alienation occurred, mothers end up losing custody, and a lot of the times children end up being forced by the courts to live or visit unsupervised with an abusive or violent parent that they've reported is harming them. So that's, as a child protection organization, that's our concern, is that it's a tool that's being used that's not scientifically valid, and it's harming a lot of children.
Let's talk about, you were talking about junk science. I mean, how is it described as a science, or let's talk about parental alienation syndrome, which I understand is the term where this comes from, and the kind of diagnosis that is made and by who it is made. I mean, why is it that you call it junk science, and what's the scientific conversation around it?
Well, Richard Gardner created the concept and wrote a book about it decades ago, and he ended up committing suicide in a very gruesome way with a steak knife, and so a lot of the courts that were using parental alienation have distanced themselves from the syndrome language of PAS. Now it's got a number of different offshoots like malicious mothering or pathogenic parenting, or they've come up with situational delusion is a new one that says that any mother who comes into court believing her children when they say they're being harmed is only delusional about that particular thing, that their child was abused. Otherwise, they're fully functional in their lives. These are just made up diagnoses or, syndromes that for higher psychologists come into court using, and there's no basis in, there's a Daubert standard in the courts that needs to be applied to see if science is something that can be replicable, and there's simply no data showing that parental alienation fits scientific criteria.
But does it happen? I mean, do you acknowledge that, yes, some parents will basically, keep a child from the other parent for no legitimate reason?
Yes, and I would say that that parent is exhibiting coercive control. So I don't buy into using junk science labels as a way to tell people how to parent. So yes, some parents will badmouth the other parent to their children, but what the dangers of parental alienation is that it completely pushes legitimate child abuse under the rug. And so it's being used by the courts to basically shift the attention away from whether real legitimate abuse has happened to the children and focus on the parent who someone just can throw it out there that they're, an alienator, and suddenly the entire proceeding changes and the outcome is typically not a good one when alienation is involved. Mm-hmm. And there's very little discovery that goes on around proving alienation.
Let me ask you, Joe, you deal with a lot of, especially fathers, but parents in general, who say that they have been alienated wrongfully or for not a good reason, which I assume would be abuse. Parents who say that they've been pushed out of their child's life. How common is, in your opinion, parental alienation?
Obviously, the people that I talk to, most of them come from high conflict situations, and a high percentage of
high conflict.
It means that the parents go into court and there's conflict over custody or finances, and so then they hire attorneys or not, and they just kind of continue fighting. And so it seems like the higher conflict the case is, the more likely there are to have alienation alleged or abuse alleged. And then because there's no oversight of the courts, these sorts of things kind of go on forever. And so as far as parental alienation syndrome being junk science, there's not really a separate category to diagnose this, but that doesn't mean that either of the parents don't have a problem themselves. It seems like in a high percentage of these cases where there's a lot of conflict, there tends to be a parent that has some kind of personality disorder, and that escalates the conflict. And then the other parent has to try to fight back to protect themselves against that. And that's where these false allegations can be waged. And then, one of the parents will try to marginalize the other using the court system. And so I think what it comes down to is that we need better trained professionals to be able to go in and figure out what's really happening in the case. Whenever there's abuse alleged, that needs to be a separate category to have, Child Protective Services should step in. All of these issues are trying to be handled in family court, where that expertise doesn't exist and the judges just don't have enough training in it.
How do you feel about this? I know that there are a lot of experts who come into the family court system who are either psychologists, therapists, social workers who have some kind of license and are still weighing on parental alienation, which you, Kathleen, consider is not a real science that has a place in the court. How do you respond to that?
So the question is, do I believe that it's not being...
that there's not enough experts, or that, the courts don't have enough professionals dealing with this.
Yeah, honestly, I think part of the problem in family law is there are too many psychologists and third parties that get appointed to these cases, and judges end up usurping their authority to these professionals and just trusting implicitly that the small list of people that they refer all their cases to are ethical and are up to date on all the important science that underlies, their work, and that's simply not the case. There's no oversight of these psychologists, special masters, mediators. There's a whole cottage industry of professionals that have immunity when they work in family courts, and so that's really a recipe for junk science to thrive when you have no accountability, no checks and balances, And these people are making hundreds of thousands of dollars in some of these cases to use junk science and
to declare parental alienation.
Right,
cases
and parental
where there's
alienation
abuse.
is being trained. I mean, lawyers, judges, psychologists at the AFCC are being trained in parental alienation. Just in February in San Francisco, there was workshops about parental alienation. So even though they'll say at the legislature or they'll say publicly we don't allow alienation in our courts, I've seen numerous court orders where parents are accused of alienation and lose custody of their children to violent perpetrators or people that the children have said are sexually abusing them. And it's pretty rampant. It's the number one reason that children get placed into dangerous homes is the throwing around of this term.
I want to engage the audience and I want to bring in the audience rather, because a lot of people are commenting. I read from, let's see, over here, Peggy Rodriguez. She asked about grandparent alienation. I don't know that this is something that is determined in the court, but do you guys have anything to say about grandparent alienation? Is this something that we should be talking about, concerned about, bringing into the parental alienation conversation?
Well, obviously, it's always in a child's best interest to have a really strong bond with both parents, and for both parents to have a really strong bond with the child, and that includes having strong bonds with the rest of their family. So a lot of times when you do have a parent, who's trying to manipulate the system or take away a child, from the other parent, that's going to result in the alienation with grandparents as well. And
it could be the case that, the grandparents, there is a reason why the child should not be with one parent, but perhaps should be with the grandparent still. But
I think the questioner might also be suggesting that sometimes grandparents are trying to pit the children against the other parent and not their own child. So certainly, grandparents can engage in that kind of behavior just like a parent can. But again, the courts are misusing this behavior as a way to put kids in harm's way.
I'm getting a message here from Dan O'Leary. He says, what of situations where the child or children have never claimed abuse, but rather the custodial parent has misled the authorities claiming domestic violence without evidence, triggering the massive powers of oh no, I lost the message. they refresh live of a state family court system to go in without evidence proactively to prevent the alleged abuse, forming a pretext for future custody disputes. You got all that?
Yeah, I think I generally understand the question, and this comes down to the fact that there are a lot of tools that can be misused in family courts, especially if you have an unscrupulous attorney who's willing to kind of go along with that. And so if you are a parent who wants to try to get primary custody, even if the other parent's not abusive, there are a lot of tools at your disposal that you could use. And that's kind of one of the things
What kind of tools?
For example, filing a domestic violence restraining order. And in California, in a family court, the definition of domestic violence is much different than in a criminal court. In a criminal court, it basically has to be like physical abuse. But under California law, in family court, it could just be disturbing the peace. That's literally a term. And it's a really vague thing.
Stalking is not physical abuse, but it can still constitute a reason why you can get a restraining order.
Yeah, and that's also under the criminal statute as well. It's just that in family court, the burden of proof is much lower. And so then, it does become difficult to sort through all of the facts and to determine what's right and what's not sometimes. And because of that, a good parent can, have their custody disrupted.
I'm hearing from Brenda here who says there are many experts, but judges only appoint the ones that will deliver the result wanted. They have a relationship mostly in the AFCC. Why are they using the same people otherwise? Is this something that you've come across? Judges having experts that they will trust more or will work with more or will recommend. How does that work?
Well, a lot of counties have a list of just a handful of people that they give to litigants when they're in court to say, here's a custody evaluator you can use, a list of 3 or 4. A lot of times the people on that list, and particularly one in this area, the Sacramento greater area, has over 60 complaints against her at the Board of Behavioral Sciences, and she continues to wreak havoc in families after 3 decades of complaints. And she's been on these lists in Placer County, Sacramento County. So the person that weighed in is correct, that there seems to be a small cadre of professionals that are appointed by judges. A lot of times they are steeped in this alienation theory. And
is
it's
there no
very
oversight
difficult to
on
find
them?
evaluators that aren't.
Is there no oversight? I mean, is there no way for there to be consequences when somebody, I mean, like a malpractice lawsuit or anything
they
of that
have
sort?
complete immunity, or it's called quasi-immunity when psychologists work in family law cases. So you cannot sue someone if they lie in your case or if they harm you or your children, even though they have to have liability insurance in private practice. As soon as people work in the courts, they have complete immunity. So it's really challenging. They're supposed to be overseen, and there are complaints that can be lodged with these oversight agencies, the BBS and the Board of Psychology, but their discipline rates are like the CJP, which deals with judges, like 1% of all complaints result in any sort of discipline. And here you've got the serial abuser who's worked in dozens of cases, and to the point where people have gone through the effort to find out where to file a complaint, and yet she's still practicing. And it's been very difficult to get people who are not ethical, who shouldn't be working in this field, to be disciplined.
Somebody says eliminate child support and watch how much of this goes away. How much of the problem is pegged to our states or federally or federal laws around child support?
I think that the child support laws are definitely something that needs to be looked at. If we compare the way that we calculate child support versus other countries, we do it much differently. We essentially base it on the difference between the parent's income as opposed to basing it on what the child's actual expenses are. And a lot of times that does result in really large child support awards. And so if you have 2 parents with a high discrepancy in income, the parent with the lesser income will often want to try to get more custody so that they can get more support. And vice versa. If you're the higher earning parent, you'll try to get more custody so that you have to pay less support. And I do generally agree that if you were to redo that support formula so that the awards weren't as high and were based more on the expenses of raising the child, that would likely reduce a lot of the conflict in the cases.
Do you agree with this?
I do. I think that it's tough if you've been in a domestic violence marriage for 20 years and you don't have access to, you haven't been working, you're a stay-at-home mom. It's hard to say you just take the child and don't worry about any money to help support if you haven't been the primary breadwinner in a family. But I do think that a lot of the strife in family law is connected to child support, and yet a lot of parents don't have the ability to just walk away from that without, some help from the court or from their ex-spouse. So it's complicated, like a lot of family law is.
So there's an incentive for parents to request, to demand custody even when they are not interested in parenting. Somebody asked if a parent hasn't tried to see their child in 2 years, can I remove their parental rights? Is that a possibility that they have, or is that something that they can do legally? Anytime you step foot in court, you're opening up a Pandora's box of potential problems that you didn't bank on. So, courts in California are very focused on giving both parents ongoing access to children, and any parent who goes in trying to limit the other parent's access to the child is usually punished and going to face some pretty severe consequences. So even if a parent, I've heard of cases where a parent hasn't been involved for 6 years and they swoop in out of nowhere and end up getting 50-50 custody, and they've got no relationship with the child whatsoever. So 2 years doesn't seem like that long of a time, and the courts like to give both parents access. I think one of the conversations that I've found most intriguing when it comes to parental alienation and in these discussions that I've had with both parents is, okay, we're talking about the nightmares of custody cases in family court. And one of those nightmares for some parents is never seeing their child again. For a different parent, the nightmare is my child ending up in the custody of an abusive parent. What kinds of systems should we have in place to prevent a child from being removed from the life of or from contact of a loving, good parent? And how likely is that to happen in our court system? And also in the case of abuse, I mean, what should be there in place to protect children from ending up in the custody of an abuser just because the other parent couldn't reach that burden of proof or that level of proof that a court might expect?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think this comes down to the fact that we really need highly trained experts to be able to diagnose these situations, because a child will always display different sort of behavioral characteristics if there is actual abuse going on versus if there's some kind of alienation behavior that's happening. So if a parent is trying to kind of coach a child or ally with them against the other parent, the child will display, a different set of symptoms as opposed to if they're being really legitimately abused. And so I think if we have these psychologists that are being well trained in this area, it can work, but we also need oversight of those psychologists, because a lot of times, like Kathleen was saying, there are psychologists who will come in that have relationships with judges and attorneys, and unbeknownst to the parent, they're making decisions that go completely against all the evidence. So we need generally more oversight, electronic recording, document filing, so that we can see what's happening and begin collecting data related to what's happening in family courts.
And the issue of coaching, I mean, how common is it that a child can be successfully coached to come up with allegations of abuse that are false?
It's extremely rare in all the research, the social research that exists. About 5% or less of children reporting sexual abuse are fabricating or lying about it, and yet the courts act as if 95% of the time it's the child being coached or making something up. That is really at the root of parental alienation, is this belief that children are being coached to lie, and yet there's very little incentive. If you just think about it from a common sense perspective, children love both of their parents. Even if one of them is abusing them, they don't get a lot of payoff for lying to a court of law about, being harmed by a parent. It's very difficult, which is why so many attorneys across the state are telling parents, even if there is evidence of abuse, unless you have a video of your child being abused, don't bring it up in court, because you're going to lose your child for raising abuse allegations. So the courts have kind of overcorrected. They've gone to this extreme.
So this is one of those unintended consequences where you consider that there's been a process of overcorrecting. So
that's right. Perhaps it used to be the tender years doctrine early on in family court, where courts would err in terms of giving mothers custody and believing that children, especially young children, should be placed with their mothers in the tender years between 0 and 7. And now it's gone to the other extreme, where any abuse allegation is going to lead to you losing your children. And yet you look at the data and no one disputes 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 8 boys are sexually molested by the time they're 18. And usually it's by someone known to them, and often it's a parent. So the courts act as if none of those data come in through the door.
Abuse is not common.
And yet where are the abuse? Most parents don't even end up in family court. That's the other thing. The courts don't acknowledge that there are a lot of people coming into family court where you've got one of the two parties that does have a cluster B personality disorder, and they don't recognize that, and I think that's a big part of the problem.
I think Jose Luis, I wrote it down so it wouldn't disappear. Jose Luis is asking, do you believe in gatekeeping tactics? Is this a thing?
Just generally gatekeeping means that one of the parents is doing something to try to prevent the other parent from having, more time with the child. And so that can mean that they're, trying to coach the child or, wage false allegations against the other. Mm-hmm. As far as trying to coach the child to say that, the father was, abusive or sexually abusive, that might not happen that much of the time. But if you have a really good psychologist, they can easily get, through to the child to figure out if those allegations are real or not. And so again, I think that's where really highly trained experts can come in and actually resolve the situation.
Ginger Gentile, who I understand is making a film about this issue, says there is a payoff for the child to make a false accusation when they have to go home to a manipulative parent. Is this something that you would like to respond to?
Yeah, and again, I would say that's coercive control that manipulative, abusive parent is exerting over the child. It's not parental alienation. Children, what's missing in this whole debate about alienation is that children have legitimate reasons for being estranged from a parent, and the parental alienation industry never seems to acknowledge that. That children may not want to go be with a parent because that parent has harmed them or abused them or doesn't treat them well, is more interested in their new girlfriend or boyfriend than the children themselves. I mean, there's very little discussion in the parental alienation realm around what are the legitimate reasons for kids to prefer one parent over another.
So basically, we are working in a system where if a child doesn't want to go with a parent, we are assuming, or the courts are assuming, this is parental alienation, one parent must be kind of poisoning the child against the other parent when there could be other factors. And you're saying they're not weighing those factors.
Exactly. I mean, you cannot force a child to love a parent. That's the part of family law that is just ludicrous. And there's a whole industry of psychologists who are thinking that you can brainwash children into believing that their safe, nurturing parent is their abuser, and parental alienation is as bad as child abuse. And I mean, there's some pretty outrageous things being said which, don't deal with the fact that children have actual experiences with their parents that can create a tremendous amount of estrangement.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are cases where, a child can somewhat be manipulated by a parent who does have some kind of like personality disorder, like whether it's narcissistic disorder or borderline personality disorder. And I think one of the people who does a really good job with this issue is Dr. Craig Childress. He's kind of really looked at parental alienation, and he agrees that parental alienation syndrome is not a real thing. There is no science to support it. But you have to get past that and dig into the actual personality disorder or pathology of the two parents. Because anytime you have a parent with a narcissistic or borderline personality disorder who is going to go to court and wage war over custody or finances, there's a very high chance that there could be some false allegations floating around, and that parent could try to manipulate the child. But he looks at diagnosing the parents, as opposed to putting in this syndrome and then having the judge say, oh, this syndrome is here, so you need to remove that child from the parent who is making those allegations. Even if a parent is trying to use those tactics against the other, it's not in the best interest of the child to be removed from that parent. That the situation should be resolved by therapy instead.
If I could respond.
We have just a few seconds left.
Dr. Craig Childress actually just was denied the ability to ever present at the AFCC because of his workshop last year at the AFCC. A complaint was filed with the American Psychological Association, and a resolution just came forward in the last couple of weeks saying that he is no longer allowed to present about his attachment-based parental alienation. So they have had to switch out his workshop with a different workshop because of the complaint that what he was presenting at the AFCC was simply not scientifically valid. So I don't see him as a very credible source on the subject.
We just have a few seconds left. If you can tell me really briefly, what is the most important thing we need to arrive at truth and protection for children? 30 seconds. Keep 15 seconds.
Yeah, I mean, highly trained experts. We don't have enough of them, in the family court system, and the ones that are there, there's no oversight.
Kathleen?
I would say accountability and making child protection the #1 priority, which there's a move in Congress right now to do with House Concurrent Resolution 72.
Thank you both. We have to cut it right away, but this conversation will continue for the rest of the month of May. Please stay tuned. Thank you.